A brutal war in the deserts of Sudan. No, we're not talking about the current conflict that's ripping that country apart. We're looking at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, one of the greatest colonial battles of the Victorian era.
You can't look at them coming on, shut your eyes. I'll nudge you when to open them.
Let's set the scene. The British are on the warpath in Sudan and they've got a score to settle with the Mahdist forces. But this isn't just about avenging the death of General Gordon in Khartoum. Some of you might be as old as me and remember the film of that. Omdurman is a battle that will change the face of warfare forever. A battle that pitted swords and spears against the deadliest machines of the industrial age. We're going to explore how a massive, brave but ultimately outmatched Mahdist army charged head-on into a wall of fire. It's a fascinating battle. Kitchener was in command and Winston Churchill was there. I wonder what happened to him. There is an incredible charge by the 21st Lancers, one of the last great charges of the British Army, and casualties, well, they are very horrific.
Bloody hell!
Stay tuned till the end to find out more about that. Today we're interviewing the fantastic military historian Keith Surridge, author of the gripping book Onwards to Omdurman. He's going to help us understand the full campaign leading up to Kitchener's famous victory in the desert in 1898.
Omdurman has been called the most spectacular battle of the scramble for Africa. Edward Spears calls it that, and he's right. It's a very big battle, and it was the culmination of a 2-year campaign launched by the British officered Egyptian army, and which would later include British troops as well at Omdurman. It ensured that the British would control the Sudan, the modern Sudan, and especially the valley of the River Nile as well, which was a very big strategic interest as far as the British were concerned. Control of the Nile was something they needed to ensure so that they could keep control of Egypt as well. And there was concerns at that time as well that a foreign power might be able to dam the Nile at some point, and then that would affect control of Egypt. So control of the whole Nile River Valley was the big strategic interest for the British, and that was one of the main reasons why they were in that part of the world at that time.
But it's also important to remember that this was an Egyptian campaign, not actually a British one, at least officially. Kitchener was very careful to fly Egyptian flags. The British had occupied Egypt in 1882, and in doing so, they had inherited its problems. That was a common theme in empire, the biggest of which was the ongoing Mahdist revolt in Sudan.
And that revolt had begun by a man called Mohammed Ahmed, who's better known as the Mahdi. And it was a popular revolt, an Islamic revolt, and as well. The Mahdi was all about going back to basics as far as Islam was concerned. The Egyptians were considered to be apostates, heretics almost, that sort of thing. And the fact as well that the Egyptians used European officers in the Sudan didn't go down well either. The Egyptian military was incompetent. It was poorly officered. The men were conscripted for life. They didn't want to fight in the Sudan, and very quickly Mohammed Ahmed began to capture important places, raise the flag of revolt amongst the Sudanese, gather adherents, gather weapons from the defeated Egyptians, and gradually moved on towards Khartoum, a city built by the Egyptians when they had first conquered the Sudan, which was about the 1820s, 1830s, something like that. While that was all going on, the British sort of came round very slowly to realise that this was now their responsibility as well, now that they were in effective control of Egypt. They sent a British officer, a retired British officer, William Hicks, with the remains of the Egyptian army that they'd defeated to the Sudan to try and defeat the Mahdi. Hicks was not or was a competent soldier,
Yes.
but of course he had poor material, and his army moved into the desert. They were sort of lured further into the desert in a place called Shay Khan, and where his army was destroyed. And Hicks Pasha, as he became known, it's a famous incident depicted in the film Khartoum, starring Charlton Heston and Laurence Olivier. And with that victory, the Mahdists, or the dervishes, as the Victorians called them, the Mahdists gained a lot of weapons, rifles in particular. Most of their forces were sword and spearmen, but they gained a lot of rifles. They had used a lot of rifle troops already. And then once they had defeated Hicks Pasha's army, they could move on to Khartoum there afterwards. And this is what they did. They reached the Nile opposite Khartoum and began the siege of Khartoum. And in the meantime, there was a lot of Egyptians, Europeans in Khartoum who needed to be evacuated. And famously, the British government was sort of bullied into sending Charles Gordon, who had been out there already. He'd served the Egyptians in the 1870s, tried to end the slave trade, caused the whole issue a lot of problems because there was a lot of resistance to that. He failed, basically, but he did try to ameliorate Egyptian rule in the Sudan. He tried his best, but he went to Khartoum with the orders to evacuate. He didn't. Gordon sort of stayed put when he should have evacuated, and there was a clamour in Britain to get him out, to relieve Gordon. The best soldier at the time, Garnet Worsley, was sent out at the end or summer sort of time, end of summer 1884. He botched the relief of Gordon, and one of the soldiers there who spoke Arabic, British soldiers who spoke Arabic, was leading a band of anti-Mahdist tribesmen. That was Horatio Herbert Kitchener. He was the last British officer in contact with Gordon. I've got a feeling, and he would write the final report with a famous conclusion about how Gordon was sort of betrayed and how heroic he was and everything else. Anyway, the relief of Gordon was a complete failure. Gordon was killed. Queen Victoria was incensed, and the British had to retreat from Sudan. The Mahdists followed them. The Mahdists were beaten on the frontier. And then from 1885-86, there would be a few actions on the frontier. But in general, the new Mahdist regime in Sudan was left alone.
Now, when Kitchener marched on Omdurman in 1898, you can only imagine the amount of supplies they had to carry with them across the desert. It's enough to make a quartermaster weep. But what they were missing out on, what they could have done with, was access to the Army and Outdoors website. Army and Outdoors, who used to be known as Kiwi Disposals, have been around for more than 30 years, supplying everything from hard-wearing military surplus to rugged outdoor gear. Hunters, filmmakers, history buffs, they all shop there. Basically, anyone who wants gear that lasts and doesn't cost the crown jewels. They're proud Kiwis based down in New Zealand, but don't worry, you don't have to row across the Indian Ocean to get your hands on their gear. Their busy online store does ship worldwide, so whether you're in Cheltenham, Cairo or Christchurch, they can get you what you need. Top lads. Now, sadly, I doubt you can get yourself a genuine British Army Maxim gun from the Battle of Omdurman, but what you can get is fantastic outdoor surplus military gear and maybe a few props for your next war film, that sort of thing. Sturdy pack, they've got you covered. By the way, even if you aren't buying, the website's worth a look with blog posts on stuff that's right up my alley, the science of camouflage, an intro to ammo cans, all that good stuff. And the best bit, guys, you don't have to march across Africa to get your hands on the kit. I've actually got an affiliate link in the description below this video. Click on that, it will take you to their website, and it's an affiliate link, which means anything you buy via that link, I'll get a few quid thrown back to me. So thank you very much for that. It will help support the channel too. So if you fancy owning a bit of history you can actually wear, or you just want quality kit that won't fall apart after a weekend, check out Army and Outdoors. Tell them Redcoat History sent you. All right, let's get back to the Battle of Omdurman.
The Mahdi himself died not long after, succeeded by his chief subordinate, the Khalifa. For the next decade, the British were content to leave the Khalifa in charge. They had bigger problems. They needed to consolidate the government of Egypt, get its finances back on track, and reform its army. They were prepared to leave Sudan alone as long as the Khalifa wasn't a threat to the Suez Canal, their route to India, of course. All the while, Kitchener, who had risen to command the Egyptian army, was itching to avenge Gordon and prove that his new army could fight.
So, yes, he was ready, with the Egyptian army. By the time the campaign started in 1896, they were ready to go. By 1896, it was much more of a professional army than it had been beforehand. As I mentioned, when the British invaded Egypt in 1882, the Egyptian army was in very poor shape generally. As I say, it was an army of conscripts who were in effect conscripted for life. And then once they were too old, they were simply discharged wherever they were and told to go back to your village, which many never made it to. The officers were incompetent. They took no interest in their men. They took no interest in their profession. So it had to be, once the British were in control, it had to be reformed root and branch. And this is what they would do. British officers were brought in. The commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army was known as the Sirdar, which I think is more Turkish term. Most of the ranks were Turkish because Egypt was still nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire. And British officers were brought in with NCOs as well to help the training. It was a very lucrative appointment for British officers. There was always, I believe, a queue of officers wanted to join because it was very well paid, better paid than the British Army. The thing was, though, British officers had to speak or know 3 languages, colloquial Arabic, Turkish, because I think most of the military commands were in Turkish, and also French, which was the sort of main European language spoken in Egypt. Egypt had been very close to France in the 19th century. So they had to know that. Kitchener was a perfect Arabic speaker. He spoke French as well. And Sir Henry Evelyn Wood was the first Sirdar. He got the ball rolling. About 6,000 men were conscripted. Conscription was still the case, but in the reformed Egyptian army, it would be the conscript would serve for 4 years in the colours, 8 years in the reserve. And they were well treated, new barracks. British officers were very professional. They took an interest in their men. They took an interest in their professional employment as well. And gradually, the army was reshaped, well trained, rearmed, and by the time of 1896, it built up a sizable reserve as well.
But the elite of this army weren't naturally born Egyptians. They were troops known as the Sudanese. These black African soldiers were considered to be the best troops in the Egyptian army. Military service was seen as a way of ending their slavery and gaining social status. They were professionally minded, and soldiering was everything to them. They were given a lot of privileges, like being allowed to have their wives and children with them on campaign. They were also spared from heavy labour like building the railways. This enhanced their sense of themselves, their social standing, and made them feel elite. And they would play a pivotal role at Omdurman. But what about the Mahdist army? What do we know about them?
Mahdist society was military, and everyone, particularly for the Battle of Omdurman, every male that was old enough in Omdurman was considered part of the army. And the army was based on its weaponry. So the vast majority of Mahdist forces carried just swords, spears and shields. There was a rifle section, several thousand, known as the Jihadiyya. They were armed with what were by 1896 be obsolete Remington rifles, captured mostly from the Egyptians, and any old guns they got from the gun trade, the weapons trade that was endemic in Africa as well, anything like that. So elephant guns. I'll come back to that because the only British officer killed at Omdurman was killed by a bullet from an elephant gun. And they had those rifles. The other organisation is the Mullah Zamin, which is the Khalifa's bodyguard. And the Jihadiyya and the Mullah Zamin are Sudanese, black Sudanese slave soldiers. The Mullah Zamin, because they are his enormous bodyguard, which was under the command of the Khalifa's son, Osman Sheikh al-Din, they are privileged. They are much more privileged. The Jihadiyya, the riflemen by 1896, are not so privileged, and this is where the Egyptian army got its deserters from. At the time of the Mahdi and afterwards, when the Sudan was at war with Abyssinia, the riflemen were very well used. This is the thing. They had a good general called Abu Anja who knew how to use his riflemen. He would use them as a block and I think against the Abyssinians as a defensive force to break up the massed Abyssinian ranks and then allow the sword and spearmen to do their work afterwards. And but thereafter, by 1896, they've forgotten all that. Abu Anja's dead. I think he dies in 1889 under mysterious circumstances. They've forgotten how they should use their riflemen, and this is something I'll talk about when we get to Omdurman. They are not very well used at all. And if they had been used properly, even with these obsolete weapons, they could still have inflicted quite a few casualties, more than they certainly did. Then you have the cavalry. They had a lot of good cavalry, and the mounted forces, the main mounted forces, were from the Baggara tribe, or Bakara tribe, of which the Khalifa was a member. The British were very concerned about them. They knew they were very good cavalry, and they always wondered how Egyptian troops would stand up to a Baggara charge, for example. They had artillery they'd captured from the Egyptians. There was about 35 guns that should have been available at Omdurman. I think only 5 were used because the rest were actually put into forts along the Nile to try and oppose the gunboats. But the shells they were using, again, suffered because of lack of proper technology in Omdurman. They were very badly charged with the gunpowder, just wasn't good enough. The British were armed with a much more modern rifle than the Egyptian army. We mentioned that they were still armed with the Egyptians were still armed with the Martini Henry. The British were armed with the Lee Metford rifle, which was a magazine rifle. They carried clips of 5 bullets each, and that made the rate of fire a lot better. They also had Maxim machine guns. The British had the .303, and the Egyptian Maxim, I think, was calibrated to use the .450 bullet, so it was the same as the Martini Henry. They were mounted on wheels. They were sort of carriages which could be towed along by mules and everything else. Yes. And I think if I remember as well, the gunner could sit down on a chair and shoot. So very effective. Now there were gunboats as well. These were one of the main weapons that Kitchener deployed, because it meant that the Egyptians, the Anglo-Egyptians, controlled the Nile. They made life very difficult for the Mahdists in getting supplies and forces across in the earlier parts of the campaign.
The decisive battle itself began on September the 2nd, 1898. The Anglo-Egyptian force, about 25,000 strong, was dug into a defensive position on the Cavalry plain, with the Nile at its back. Facing them was the Mahdist army, a massive force of anywhere from perhaps 40 to 60,000 men. The Anglo-Egyptians had their British divisions protected by a thorn bush fence, while the Egyptians had a more effective shelter trench.
And what the battlefield itself, it wasn't completely flat. There was a gentle slope, I think for about 1,000 yards, something like that. Meant that the Anglo-Egyptian force could not see, well beyond the plain into the desert, because there was this slight rise, and the ground was corrugated. There were dips and bumps and bushes and things like that. So it wasn't entirely clear. But once the Mahdist forces topped that rise, then they would be in complete sight of the Anglo-Egyptians there afterwards. To the south of the Anglo-Egyptian position was another piece of high ground known as the Jebel Surgham. And it was on here, you have the 21st Lancers, the only British cavalry.
The Mahdist forces poured out of Omdurman, ready to confront them. What happened next?
The Mahdist tactics that day have been described as imbecilic and, absolutely useless and everything else, and they were. There was methods to the madness. The Khalifa and his generals, as Zolfo mentions in his book, had planned a giant ambush. Now, because you have high ground to the north and south of the British position, these were going to be crucial areas, because part of the plan was for the Mahdist forces to take those positions, put themselves on those positions, and in the meantime, an attack on the Anglo-Egyptians would either break in, that was what they hoped more than anything, but if not, then it would do enough to lure the Anglo-Egyptians out of their position to march westwards across the plain, heading for Omdurman. And while they were outside of that, then the forces on the high ground to the north and south would then charge down, and then an enormous reserve would hit the Anglo-Egyptians at the front. So that was the plan. While the tactics might have been imbecilic, the battle strategy wasn't too bad, but it depended on a lot of command and control, which the Sudanese generals just did not have. Yeah. And there were various sort of nuances that meant that they just were not in control of their men as well as they ought to have been. The Sudanese under Osman Azrak, they launched this headlong charge, but there's also a charge coming from the southern high ground, the Jebel Surgham. There's a Sudanese Mahdist force coming there, Ibrahim al-Khalil with his white flags. They're coming from that direction, hitting the extreme left. Well, that's what they hope, to hit the extreme left of the Anglo-Egyptian line, which is the British. And then the main attack, which is actually facing the British forces more than it's the Egyptians. So they launched this mass attack. And this is where tactically they go wrong, because instead of using the riflemen perhaps to advance first, to then get a position to start shooting at the Anglo-Egyptians, soften them up, which they might have done if this had been a few years earlier, the riflemen are all mixed up. The cavalry is all mixed up. So you have the cavalry leaders, the emirs, with their big flags, and that's what everyone talks about, all the flags and everything else. So the cavalry leaders have got their followers with them, perhaps groups of horsemen. Instead of being all together as a cavalry force, there's groups of horsemen interspersed with the sword and spearmen and the riflemen. So the Jihadiyya are not a separate unit. They're just, and they have forgotten how to operate as a force in itself. So they're running along and they're firing from the hip. Basically, they're hitting nothing. So the battle opens, as I say, with this huge charge in the centre and from the Mahdist right against ostensibly the British part of the line. And as you say, they are slaughtered eventually. And Ibrahim al-Khalil is on the right, is killed. Osman Azrak is killed. All the top generals are killed. The main damage, it seemed to the British, was caused by about 300 riflemen who eventually dived into some cover and began firing at the British line from a few hundred yards away. But nonetheless, this is where the British casualties occur. And I mentioned that the only officer killed, a Captain Caldecott of the Warwicks, I think he was standing on a bit of high ground looking over the heads of his men, and the Mahdist did tend to shoot high. They lack proper training in that respect. And his jugular vein was severed by an elephant, a bullet from an elephant rifle, and down he went. A lot of the men were wounded, like with spent bullets because of the poor gunpowder and things like that. One of the journalists there was Frank Rhodes, brother of Cecil Rhodes. He was wounded at that point, I think, and taken down to the river. So he missed most of the battle as a result. The initial attack is stopped. There's, with great slaughter to the Mahdists, and all the British officers will write about how brave the Mahdists were. Townsend writes about some old boy with a flag getting to about 150 yards of his line and before he's shot down and everything else. It was, uncommon bravery, perhaps mixed with a bit of religious fanaticism as well, martyrdom,
Yes.
whatever. But they had expected that to a certain degree. Well, that this would fail. And then the part the Mahdists wanted, was that soon afterwards, the Anglo-Egyptians start to move out of their defensive position onto the plain. In the meantime, the northern part of the battle, the Kareri Hills, the Egyptian cavalry and the Camel Corps had positioned themselves there, and they were attacked by a huge force. There were two green standards. The Khalifa's son was in nominal charge of this, Osman Sheikh al-Din, but he was no battlefield commander. He was a young man in his 20s, and he was a Nepo baby, shall we say. I think that's the term they use these days. And he was surrounded by his bodyguards. He couldn't do anything even if he wanted. But there was a lot of riflemen. There was a lot of the Mulazamin, the better riflemen in that group. And they headed for the Camel Corps. They were on two hills, the Egyptian cavalry and Camel Corps, with about 1,000 yards in between. And they headed for the Camel Corps, who were not exactly, full of powerful rifles. They fired carbines, and, they had artillery, but the sheer speed and the amount of men meant they were in danger, despite the Egyptian cavalry firing at them as well. Douglas Haig was there. His trumpeter got a bullet in the head. But as Haig said afterwards, he seemed very cheerful with it. It didn't seem to knock him out at all. The Camel Corps had to pack up and retreat very quickly. They lost quite a few men. Two of the guns were abandoned as well. And Colonel Broadwood, who was commanding the Egyptian cavalry, ordered a retreat to the north. The Camel Corps, meanwhile, had to get back to the main position, and they were chased all the way. And this is where a couple of the gunboats come in handy, because they sailed up to that point and added their firepower to the Egyptian forces that were shooting down the Mahdists who were chasing the Camel Corps. So the Camel Corps does get back into the main position. It wasn't massacred, and the Mahdists retreat back to the hills. And in the meantime, most of the Mahdist force is chasing Broadwood's cavalry for about 4 or 5 miles or so into the desert before they give up and then start coming back. So that was a mistake. They should never have done that. They should have just captured the hills and waited.
Down the trot.
Now, one of the most famous and enduring images of this battle, made even more famous by the presence of a young Winston Churchill, is the charge of the 21st Lancers. Kitchener, worried about street-to-street fighting, had sent them out with orders to shepherd the retreating Mahdists away from Omdurman. But the regiment was tired of being ridiculed for never having seen action. When they were fired on by a few hundred Mahdists hiding in a dry riverbed, or a khor as I think the Sudanese called it, their commander, Colonel Martin, gave the order to charge. What they didn't know was that there were thousands of men hiding there, not just a few hundred.
They had been positioned there to protect the Mahdist right flank, to make sure that the Anglo-Egyptians didn't try to come round the back of them early in the battle. So they're being peppered, the 21st Lancers. This was it. This was the red rag. And all of a sudden, Martin says, turn, what that be, to the right. From a column, they're now in line, and that was it. I don't think he gave the order to charge. They just charged. But that was that. They were off. Churchill was on the extreme right. He should not have been there because he was late arriving, and the troop he was going to command was given to Robert Grenfell, who I think was a nephew of General Grenfell, the second Sirdar. Robert Grenfell, say, was in charge of what should have been Churchill's troop, and that was right in the middle of the 21st Lancers line. Now, Churchill was late arriving because Kitchener didn't want him. When everyone knew this was going to be the final part of the campaign, the big battle was coming, there was a lot of officers who were saying, please take me on and everything else. And Kitchener did not want Churchill. We knew he was a medal hunter. And so Churchill's mother did a lot of lobbying for her, and that's an interesting little story in itself. But he was attached to the 21st Lancers. He was a hussar himself. He was attached to the 21st Lancers as a troop commander. But because it had taken a long time to get him accepted, that's why he was late. Anyway, Churchill's there. He's commanding this other troop, and that is such a lucky break for him because they start charging. Churchill, as you see in the film, he puts his sword away and he draws out his Mauser pistol. His commander, Major Finn, also put his sword away and drew out his revolver. Now, they're charging. Colonel Martin does not draw his pistol or revolver or his sword throughout this charge, and they're being fired at. The ground is hard, stony, and that's what some of them remark upon. Stones are hitting them, the horses' hooves are bringing them up, the bullets are flying around. They're carrying, most of the troop, they're lancers. The lance weighs 4 pounds, made of bamboo. It's 9 feet long. The spearhead is 1 foot long as well. They're all charged, heads down, because of all the stones and everything else. And that's it. There's no stopping them.
No.
They go through the riflemen who are on the lip of this depression, too late to realise that instead of a few hundred there are thousands there.
Bloody hell!
And the momentum just carries them forward. But in the centre of the British line, they're facing the biggest amount of Mahdist troops, the thickest part of them. And Grenfell's troop is cut to pieces as a result. He is killed, his body is hacked to pieces. Some of the horses are just stopped dead by the amount of men that they charge into. Some of the Mahdists are literally flung into the air. They go flying, being hit by the horse. Churchill's troop, being on the right, has actually come in at an angle so they can actually get stuck in to some of the Mahdists, and Churchill will shoot his way out of the depression. But for Grenfell's troop, of the 25 men, 10 are killed, 11 wounded, some of them terribly wounded as well. And only 4 of that troop get out unscathed at all. They lose 119 horses. The regiment is effectively destroyed as a result of this charge. As I say, Martin, the colonel, rode straight through without drawing his pistol, his sword. Didn't even, he just rode all the way through. And at the end, and they managed to get out the other side, and they start to rally. And then the survivors use their carbines. They dismount, use their carbines, and shoot at the Mahdist packed in, who don't like being shot at, and they retreat, taking their wounded with them. I think they only found about 23 Mahdist bodies there. Probably quite some of the wounded would die. Yeah, it's sort of the only part of the battle where each side is armed more or less the same.
Yes.
And it's a terrible disadvantage. Osman Digna, as they point out, knew how to deal with cavalry. He'd fought the Abyssinians as well.
Yeah.
It was an ambush, and it worked almost perfectly.
The charge of the 21st Lancers, while brave, was a tactical mistake and near disaster, but it's also a perfect example of what this battle was, a clash of old against new. It was one of the last great cavalry charges in history and probably didn't really need to happen. What happened next was, however, a display of modern, disciplined firepower that would define the rest of the battle. This is where Hector Macdonald and his Sudanese battalions, as we mentioned earlier, the elite soldiers of the Egyptian army, came to the fore. Facing at least 12,000 Mahdists with his 3,000 men, Macdonald's force was made up of 3 Sudanese battalions and 1 Egyptian. Because Macdonald was a superb trainer of men, we've done a whole video on him before, his brigade stood firm.
If you remember, I mentioned about the Green Standards who had charged the Egyptian cavalry and camel corps over the northern high ground. They're coming back. One group did not charge after them. They're watching what's going on. And this is the part of the Khalifa's plan that should have worked. This is where the ambush should have happened. And Macdonald's brigade is now isolated and, it's vulnerable. Because what the British had, or the Anglo-Egyptians, Kitchener, whatever, had not realised was that the main reserve of the Mahdist army was hidden by the western part of the southern high ground. They hadn't seen it. It has the big black flag of the Khalifa. It's the black standard under his brother Yaqub. They're moving round. The British brigades haven't seen them. Maxwell's brigade, which is clearing Mahdists off the southern high ground, the Jebel Surgham, they barely noticed them. And then all of a sudden, they've moved round and they're right in front of Macdonald's brigade. There's at least 12,000 of them. Macdonald has about 3,000. And Macdonald's brigade stop, get into line, and they face Yaqub's huge force. Lewis suddenly realises the danger. He will join Macdonald a little bit later. So the whole Anglo-Egyptian army is more or less taken by surprise by this huge force having sort of appeared, so it seemed. And Macdonald's force faces them on its own. It's his brigade is made up of 3 Sudanese battalions with 1 Egyptian. Hector Macdonald is a superb trainer of men, and yes, this is what comes out. They're very well disciplined. Some of them do start shooting a bit early, and Macdonald and his officers have to go down the line knocking rifles up and things like that, saying, hold your fire, hold your fire. And eventually, Yaqub's force is mostly sword and spearmen. There is about 1,000 riflemen, but their weapons are even more obsolete than the usual rifles. They've got the dregs from the arsenal, basically. So they're still lethal. If they can get close enough, they're lethal, and they will cause casualties. So they charge. There's this massive charge against Macdonald's brigade. And Macdonald's brigade stands there with its artillery firing case shot, its machine guns as well, adding their firepower, and they destroy Yaqub's huge force. And eventually the big black flag will be captured. They think there's 100 dead men around it who stood to the last, 200 sort of wounded around it or whatever. It's, a superb display of disciplined firepower from Macdonald's brigade. Just as Yaqub's force is breaking, by which time it's being shot at by Lewis's brigade and Maxwell's brigade as well, and the British brigades have stopped, realising something's wrong. The forces on the northern high ground, the Mahdist forces on the northern high ground, the green flags, are now pouring over it. And Macdonald's brigade has to suddenly, it's facing west, it now has to face north, because it's right in the line of this attack from the northern high ground. The green flags are attacking them as well. And it's a parade ground manoeuvre. Macdonald's force, because it is so well trained, it does it. It switches face from west to north with the artillery, with the machine guns. It's joined by the Camel Corps on its right, and then the Lincolns will come there as well, been sent on. And it faces the Green Standards, who again heavily outnumber Macdonald's brigade. So they beat it off, essentially. Again, disciplined firepower. They fire, I think in these 2 actions, it's estimated Macdonald's brigade fires 160 1,000 rounds of ammunition. By the end of it, they're down to 2 bullets each, and they're beating any survivors off with bayonets. The Mahdists launched 16 attacks against Macdonald's brigade. They've run out of bullets. They're dropping their rifles. They're taking out their swords. They're in ranks, and they charge. As one rank goes down, the next one charges, and there's 16 of them. This is one of the big ifs. And one part of that green flag force had actually watched Macdonald's brigade defeat Yaqub and the Black Flag. Now, if they'd attacked at that point, they could have caused Macdonald serious damage by coming against his flank and rear. But they didn't. They sat and watched, waiting for the main force to, get back into the hills to charge. That is one of the opportunities they had, and they blew it, basically. Part of the Anglo-Egyptian army would have been destroyed, probably, if they'd have coordinated their attacks. Black flag from the west, green flags from the north. But there was no coordination. They were defeated in detail. And Macdonald survived, and his brigade survived, and Macdonald became the great hero of the battle.
And so the battle was won. Casualties for the Mahdists were horrific. Around 12,000 killed, 13,000 wounded, and 5,000 captured. British and Egyptian casualties, less than 50 dead and around 400 wounded. So what were the wider consequences of this battle? For Sudan, it meant being under British authority for decades. For the British Empire, Omdurman solidified its control of the Nile and demonstrated the brutal power of its modern army. It was a decisive victory, but also a glimpse into a new, far more lethal form of industrialised warfare. Machine guns, artillery, armoured boats, it had the lot. Thank you to Keith Surridge for this incredible deep dive, and to my mate Chris Bryce, who actually conducted the interview on my behalf. If you want to know more, I highly recommend checking out Keith's book, Onwards to Omdurman. And if you're interested in more stories from this period of history, be sure to like and subscribe, or join my Patreon page for early access to videos over at patreon.com/redcoathistory. In the meantime, me and YouTube think you'll enjoy the video that's on screen now, so check it out.